why don't we get started? I'd like to welcome everyone to the last philosophy speaker event of the fall. The speaker today is Bill Simpson. And Bill Simpson got his PhD in Boulder in 1995, and he did his dissertation on Aristotle's philosophy of mind. He's taught business ethics classes at Metro for a long time, a decade, is it?
At least a decade.
At least a decade. And he's edited a business ethics textbook. The study of, or the teaching of business ethics encouraged Bill to become interested in the study of law, and he has studied law both at the University of London and at Cambridge University. His talk today is entitled Corporations as Criminal Defendants, How Artificial Persons Have Real Responsibilities. So maybe we're finally got the thumb screws on those Enron people at the end of the talk. So can everyone please join me in welcoming Bill Simpson.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to the UCD Philosophy Department for giving me an opportunity to spend a few minutes today talking to you about how to prevent a conditional from failing. So here's our conditional. And what you'll remember from baby logic is that if the left-hand side of the conditional is true and the right-hand side of the conditional is false, then the entire expression will always come out to be false. Okay. Now, let's fill in the blanks. It's a matter of law, and as such, it's a matter of social fact that if X is a corporation and a defendant in a range of criminal cases, then that X will also be fixed with an intentional state. So let's look at some definitions. First of all, when we talk about a corporation, we're talking about an entity that's a juristic person. That simply means that the corporation is an entity that's capable of being a defendant in a legal case. It's an entity that's capable of being a party to a case. When we talk about crimes, for the most part, demonstrating a crime is going to require two components. You're going to, if you're a district attorney, you need to be able to show two things. First of all, that the defendant performed the action that is prohibited. Okay. Legal Latin for that is actus reus, the prohibited action. Second component is that you're also going to show that the defendant was fixed with mens rea, criminal intent. And if both components are not shown, then the defendant gets off. Now, there are some instances in which this doesn't occur. There are some instances of act crimes alone. Does anybody know any examples of this? Where you can be found guilty just for performing the action without having the intent. Possibly, I was thinking of statutory rape. Because remember, in statutory rape, it doesn't matter whether you didn't know that the other party was underage. You simply performed the action.
Plagiarism is like that too.
What's that?
Plagiarism also.
Is that how they do it at CU? Okay. Yeah, that you just perform the action, yeah. So I'm not talking about those sorts of crimes. I'm talking about crimes such as obstruction of justice, where you knowingly interfere. Yeah, notice the word knowingly, that's an intent state. Knowingly, or sometimes you'll see the word recklessly, or you'll see the word negligently. Or there are crimes of specific intent, murder in Great Britain. To show murder, you have to show that the person wasn't just acting recklessly, but actually intended to do in Colonel Mustard in the library. With the candles, yeah. Okay, so I'm talking about times that have that intent component. And so, and you know, if X is a corporation, X is a defendant in this range of cases, then X is fixed with intent. That sounds an awful lot. It sounds suspiciously like having a mental state, right? You know, some old German guy once said that intentionality is the mark of the mental, for crying out loud. So I mean, how is it that we can talk about a corporation, which is a legal form that's constituted through the authority of a state legislature? How can we talk about a corporation having intent, having what would seem to be a mental component to its something that's created by the legislature, a legal form that nonetheless has a seemingly inner and private life? How can we talk about that? And you can't talk about that. The conditional fails. But don't worry, because the crime will still be on the books. It will simply be just another one of those irrational laws. And so what we're trying to do is not disprove the law, but rather we're trying to show some sort of interpretation of the law that will allow us to think about it as rational. Okay. If you're a legal positivist, irrational laws will not bother you. If you're a natural law theorist, might be some worries. Okay. So what I propose to do today is talk about various ways in which people have explained how corporations have criminal intent. That's what I want to talk about. How corporations, or how people explain corporations as having criminal intent. And so first of all, look at how this is actually done in the law courts, both in the United States and Great Britain. That's the first move. The second move is to say, well, there are some problems with how courts have traditionally attributed mental states or intentional states to corporations. And then what we'll do is we'll go looking at philosophical literature and see an area in which I think we philosophers can actually shed some light on a real world problem. Okay? And we'll look at some ways in which philosophers talk about corporations having been. Philosophers will generally not talk about criminal intent. Philosophers will more than likely talk about how corporations can be moral agents. Okay? And if we have moral agency, that will certainly pick up in intent as well. Okay? And so I want to narrow the questions a lot and just talk about intent. Okay? And and leave the larger question of moral agency aside for the moment. So, first of all, in the United States, we talk about corporate criminal intent in terms of vicarious liability. That's sort of the magic word, vicarious liability. Comes out of, it's a 1909 case called the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad Company. Central New York and Hudson River Railroad Company and the United States in 1909. And what happens in that case is that as the result of legislation, something called the Elkins Act in 1903, the court said that companies could be held liable for the actions of their agents, it's like employees, who are acting within the scope of their employment. So let's say that David Ebner is driving a beer truck, working for Coors, and drives the beer truck negligently and commits some sort of intent crime involving negligence. Okay. Then the Coors brewing company will be liable for the agent's action. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, we want to avoid the few bad apples defense. Oh, it wasn't us, the corporation. We had a policy against us. It was just the bad apple doing it. Okay. So we want to be able to avoid that. The other thing that we want to do is we want to facilitate civil litigation. And one of the best ways to prove a tort is to show that the defendant in the tort action has already committed a crime. Now, why do you want to do that with a corporation when you want to have a corporation shown to have committed a crime in tort? Because corporations are where all the money is. So it's a matter of compensation. Now, that's vicarious liability. Now, in Great Britain, there's another approach. In Great Britain, what they have is something called alter ego theory or identification theory. And in alter ego theory or identification theory, what happens is the mental state of the corporation or the intent state of the corporation is identified with higher level management of the corporation. So, for example, that marvelous English judge, Lord Denning, says that this is in H.L. Bolton Engineering and Graham and Sons Limited. It's a 1956 case. Lord Denning says, a company may be in many ways likened to a human body. It has a brain, a nerve center which controls what it does. It also has hands which hold the tools and act in accordance with directions from the center. Some of the people are mere servants and agents who are nothing more than hands to do the work and cannot be said to represent the mind or will. Others are directors and managers who represent the directing mind of the company. Now notice that locution, the directing mind of the company. Okay, so we're looking, so Denning is very expressly looking for mental states within the company. And the state of mind of these managers is the state of mind of the company and is treated by the law as such. Now, how far down the food chain does corporate criminal intent go in the English law? Well, the leading case on this is a case called Nattrass and Tesco. It's from the 70s. And in Nattrass and Tesco, the manager of a supermarket, Tesco is the English version of Target. Tesco, one of the managers falsely advertised a special. And the question was Tesco liable for the misrepresentation of the sale? And the answer was no. Corporate responsibility does not go down to the level of the manager of the shop. Okay. So we have these two theories, but notice in either case, the intentional state is attributed to the corporation on the basis of the mental states of the agents of the corporation. The two theories differ simply in virtue of how far down the food chain you look. And then that's the only real difference. Now there's a problem with both of these standard theories of how corporations have intentional states. And the problem is what we call the aggregation problem. And the aggregation problem outlined in a case called United States and the Bank of New England in 1987. Now, let's be clear about something here first. Sometimes when a judge writes a legal opinion, what the judge says in the legal opinion is going to be dispositive of the case. The case is decided on this basis. Yeah, the contract failed for want of consideration, something of that sort. Okay. In other instances, you run into material in the case law called obiter dicta. And obiter dicta is Latin for stuff that's said along the way. And what the court says in Bank of New England is obiter dicta. It doesn't resolve the case. The case was decided on another basis. This is a judge speaking hypothetically. This is not how any case has been decided yet. But oftentimes in obiter, it'll give you an opportunity to see how the law is developing. Okay. And what the court says in Bank of New England is this. They say, well, corporations compartmentalize knowledge, subdividing the elements of specific duties into operations and into smaller components. The aggregate of these components constitutes the corporation's knowledge of a particular operation. Now, what's going on in the Bank of New England? Okay, there's a law that says that the bank has to report transactions, cash transactions of more than $10,000. Somebody comes into the bank and makes multiple $9,999 deposits at different teller windows, and the bank doesn't report. They are, the bank, strictly speaking, off the hook because each one of the tellers isn't fixed with mens rea, right? It's a $9,999 transaction. And there are multiple transactions. And so the worry that the court is on about is what happens to corporate mens rea when you structure transactions so that no one natural person who could be fixed with mens rea and be that lever for vicarious liability. What happens if no one agent is fixed with sufficient mens rea? Got it? And what if you can structure the transaction that way? And there's actually a beautiful example of this in a case called Arthur Anderson LLC in the United States. It's a very recent case. I can't remember. Oh yeah, it's 2005, decided by the United States Supreme Court unanimously. Yeah, and what happens in Arthur Anderson and the United States is there's this company called Enron. You might have heard of it. Their bookkeeper is Arthur Anderson LLP. Okay. And Arthur Anderson LLP has something they call the document policy. And the document policy, as one of their partners says, is this: if a document is destroyed in the course of normal policy and litigation is filed the next day, that's great. We followed our own policy. And whatever there was that might have been of interest to somebody is gone and irretrievable. Okay. So document policy is the policy of destroying the documents until the paperwork gets filed. And then you stop. That's the document policy. Okay. And that's what the partner is telling employees at training meeting. Okay. So notice that he's speaking in hypothetical terms, right? Yeah, here's our document policy. It's a general document policy. This is how we do things. This is how we roll at Art and Andy's. Okay, that's what they say. Then we have the employees who are instructed in the policy, and they say, oh, well, I am doing what I'm instructed to do, and presumably this is vetted by the legal department. I'm in the clear too. The actus reus, obstruction of justice, is achieved. The mens rea is precluded. Of course. Marvelous, right? Okay. Notice how the transaction is structured. And so what the judges in Bank of England say, what the judge in Bank of England says, is, well, what we want to do is we want to be able to impute mens rea to the corporation on the basis of aggregate knowledge. How do we do that? Okay, well, in the Art and Andy case, the court refers to this sort of speculation as the outer limits of the discussion of mens rea, and they said, well, we don't need to talk about it here. And so the aggregation problem is unresolved currently in the law. I don't know of any cases that have actually been adjudicated using aggregation. You know, the United States, we're firmly in the realm of vicarious liability, even though we have this aggregation problem. So how do we get past the aggregation problem? Well, that's where philosophers are useful. That's where we can actually do something. In our discipline, in this obscure part of the Plaza building, it's where we can actually do something. Like a friend of mine, Ed Sellers, used to say, that's philosophy that's useful. Okay. So how do we do it? Well, there are several sorts of approaches. There's one set of papers that aren't useful. These are the philosophers who just deny that corporations have moral responsibility or with that mental state. So, probably one of the more famous ways of articulating this position is Milton Friedman. Wrote an essay in 1970, published it in the New York Times magazine, so it wasn't peer-reviewed. And what Friedman said is, he says, well, a corporation is an artificial person, and in this sense may have artificial responsibilities. Presumably, the individuals who are to be responsible are businessmen, which means individual proprietors and corporate executives. Okay. So Friedman says, well, corporation, artificial person, maybe some artificial responsibilities, but no inner mental state, right? Now, that simply puts us back into vicarious liability or alter ego theory, and the aggregation problem is not resolved. Okay. There's another set of papers that give kind of sociological accounts of how corporations have inner mental states. They'll say, well, there's this thing called the corporate culture, and it arises rather mysteriously, and it's there. And I suppose the corporate culture lives on the same block as team spirit and the hush that falls over the crowd. It's that. And so I really can't get a handle on what they mean by that. And I don't think it's my fault. Secondly, thirdly, there's another set of accounts that have an almost functionalist approach to corporate mens rea. The chief wagon boss of these guys is getting Peter French down at Arizona State University. And he's been writing about this for 20 years or more now. And I think it's, I have this in your handout, and I think I should just read it to you so we're really clear about what French says. Okay? And then there's one other thing that I want to point out that's not in the handout. He says, every corporation has an internal decision structure, CID structures. Have two elements of interest to us here. An organizational responsibility flowchart that delineates stations and levels within the corporate power structure, and two, corporate decision recognition rules, usually embedded in something called corporate policy. When the Corporate Act is consistent with an instantiation or implementation of established corporate policy, then it is proper to describe it as having been done for corporate reasons, and having been caused by a corporate desire coupled with a corporate belief. So, in other words, as corporate intentional. Okay. And then French has referred to this, other people in the literature refer to this as belief desire theory, or the belief desire model. And the thing that happened immediately is people jumped all over French. And they said, well, wait a second. You're saying that corporations have beliefs and desires? It's a paper entity and a set of rules, no more than that. And French made his predicament even worse, because he said in the same paper, the collective nature of the corporation should not rail out the possibility of a corporation having metaphysical status. And so he says it. And so notice that the corporate mental state, you can think of it in terms of environmental input. There's some sort of crisis that the corporation is responding to. SEC announcing initial probe into the company's finance, something like that. So stimulus, there's an output, destruction documents, and then there's that inner stuff, beliefs and desires. And the mental state is defined or characterized in terms of all three. That's just good old-fashioned functionalism, right? Input, output, and other mental states. Usual stuff that you run into in philosophy of mind. And so people jumped all over French for this, battled him for 17 years, and then finally, in the last 5 years or so, he's taken it back. And he says, wait a second, I was wrong. I really didn't, I didn't mean it. In fact, what he says in his second version of theory, he says, quote, every corporation creates a general set of policies that are easily accessible both to its agents and to those with whom it interacts. When an action is performed by someone in employ of the corporation and is an implementation of the corporate policy and accords with its procedural rules, then it is proper to describe the act as done for corporate reasons or for corporate purposes and to advance corporate plans and is an institutional action of the corporation. And notice that's exactly what he was saying 20 years earlier, minus the intermental states. The intermental states drop out. Okay. Yeah. As you showed, the corporate mental states or corporate intentionality then is fully characterizable in terms of inputs and outputs. Full stop. And that's what it is. And that, of course, gets past all these Gilbert-Ryle type objections. Right? Remember, in the concept of mind, Gilbert-Ryle says, oh, yes, imagine somebody came to visit Oxford University. And we took them around and we showed them the library, we showed them the colleges, we showed them the Bodleian Library, on and on. And then the person asked, well, you showed me all these things, where's the university? And we say, well, you know, you've committed a category mistake. The university is not some other ghostly tertium quid in addition to the other things. The university is simply it's just this coordinated set of activities associated with different buildings, no more than that. And you don't have to look inward for the university any more than you look you look for some sort of instrument to show you where the esprit de corps of the United States Marines lives. It's simply a name for an activity, and no more than that. So we don't have to go looking for some third thing. We don't have to go looking for corporate culture. We don't have to go looking for beliefs and desires. We characterize the corporate mental state in terms of inputs and outputs only. Now there is one side issue that I think is interesting and worth pointing out, and I'll just wave my hands at it and move along. French likes to talk in terms of corporate policy. And the question that some people might want to ask is, okay, well, we're talking about corporate policy. How do I identify that? Is the corporate policy the thing that's written up in the employee handbook? They hand that out to you, right? And it says, we're all one family here. We're for good things and against bad things. That one. Okay. We'd never do anything that lacked probity, right? We'd never, far be it for us to do that. Yeah, you've seen those, right? That says it right there in the glossy, well-produced brochure. Is that the corporate policy, or is it the thing that is it the conduct that flourishes in the fecund shadow of managerial neglect, or is it the thing that your boss encourages quietly? So, oh yeah, that's public consumption. That's what we really do. So it's sort of sotto voce encouragement. Okay. Is it that? How do you identify the rule? Okay. Well, H.L.A. Hart can help us out there, right? In 1960s English jurisprudence theorist, and H.L.A. Hart says that what we look for is, in fact, the unstated rule of recognition, because the real rule of recognition is the rule of recognition that people actually appear to abide by. Okay. Yeah, we can make jokes about that, right? And like, there's the old joke about the difference between Baptists and Episcopalians, right? You know that one? The difference between Baptists and Episcopalians speak to one another in the liquor store. Okay. There's the rule that's announced, and then there's also the rule that's observed. And the rule that's observed is the one that we're interested in. And that's the sort of thing that, again, is public and easily ascertainable. So, the long and short of it, then, is that when we talk about the corporate mind or corporate criminal intent, that's public. Corporate mind, if you want to use that metaphor, the corporate mind is a fully public mind. And we can attribute intent states to the corporation on the basis of ascertainable policy and action within scope of employment, or action within a CID structure, if you want to use French's language. Okay. And notice that that's enough at that point to keep the conditional from failing. One other question that you might want to ask yourself is, well, has this actually been tried? Are there places in the common law world where you can go and convict a corporation and then have civil litigation to collect damages on the basis of the externally observable conduct of the corporation alone? Are there places where you can go to find that happening? And the answer is yes. Great Britain, as of 2007, summer. New law, it's called the Corporate Manslaughter and Homicide Act of 2007. Queen gave her assent to it this summer, I believe in July. And it's a response to this horrible disaster that happened, I believe, in the 80s. There was a drive-on, drive-off ferry. Maybe you've seen these, the sort of ferries you drive on to. Okay, there was a drive-on, drive-off ferry that was sailing between, it was Dover and Holland, and the city in Holland that I can't pronounce, so I won't humiliate myself trying. But it's sailing between these two cities, and on a number of occasions, and on this one particular occasion, the ferry set out with its bow doors open. 90 seconds into the voyage, 100 yards out to the ocean, ferry sinks, over 100 people drown. Terrible thing. And the victims of the disaster want to collect damages, and so there's an attempt to convict the corporation, the juristic person, of manslaughter, and the project fails. And so what happens? Well, this is a cause for legislation. And notice that in the New York Central case, one of the things that the court says is when we talk about defining the criminal intent of the corporation, we don't have to worry about the railroad cases, worries, like the Santa Clara County and Southern Pacific Railroad cases, in which you say, well, you have to treat a corporation just like any other party before the court because they have protections under the 14th Amendment. You don't have to worry about 14th Amendment problems when a legislature is constituting how a corporation has a mental state. And you don't have to worry about that because the corporation itself is a creature of the state legislature. If that's the case, the state legislature can define how corporations have mental states any way it wants. Like the Elkins Act can define it in terms of vicarious liability. No reason we shouldn't define corporate mental states. No reason the Great Britain Parliament shouldn't define corporate mental states in terms of overt and public behavior. No reason we can't do that. And so they wrote a statute. And here's how it goes. An organization to which this section applies is guilty of an offense if the way in which its activities are managed and organized is A, causes a person's death, and B, amounts to a gross breach of a relevant duty of care by the organization to the deceased. An organization is guilty of an offense under this section only if the way in which its activities are managed or organized by its senior management is a substantial element in the breach referred to in subsection 1. Okay. Notice this? All overt public behavior. And yet it's an intent statute. And you can thereby hold a corporation guilty of manslaughter the natural person victims' estates can collect damages. So there it is. Corporations can be fixed with criminal intent even if they don't have an intermental life.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Questions?
Yeah, so we have time for questions now, almost 20 minutes. Would you like to field your own questions? You want me to do it?
Well, I feel them. So,
Well, I'm wondering if part of the simple accommodation level of intent as far as that corporations are essentially relatively recent. And that so much of the stuff that's necessary in our actions for us is in relationship to individuals, although we may not be able to really clearly identify a specific case of mens rea as opposed to actus reus. We can at least define it and we know what it is and if there was unintentional makes sense. But since we're now dealing with relatively new organizations, corporations have been going around for a few hundred years, let's say, in the case of the East India Company or something, it's been around for centuries. But that we're trying to apply a statute or a way of legal thinking that has emerged very naturally in relationship to individual people, which is something that is a conglomeration of individual actions and praxis and those sorts of activities. And I'm wondering if there's some sort of a real category mistake in the sense that the reason we're having trouble is we're trying to do something which is essentially impossible. I can talk about species. I can talk about blades of grass as being a member of a particular species. I can talk about other little animals that might be part of a different species. But I can also talk about an ecosystem in which we live. And the emergent properties that are related to the ecosystem is not directly related to the properties of the individuals that make up that ecosystem, but an entirely different discipline of biology would apply at the level of the ecosystem as opposed to the level of the individuals. And so I'm wondering if doesn't it maybe at some point make sense, which I think in some sense we're doing here, is to say, look, we're not going to try to pound a square peg into a round hole any longer. We're going to recognize a separate structure of legal statutes that apply to a different type of entity. And we're not going to try to get an exact fit of something that really doesn't make sense, which actually does raise all kinds of questions with respect to philosophic problems, such as what French was trying to do, which is to say, in order for us to apply that which is appropriate to apply to an individual, we have to now try to see if we can find these properties in this new individual. Well, we're not trying to do that at the level of biology. We're not trying to attribute to an ecosystem the intent of a squirrel. So I'm just wondering if that's some of the problem, and is this also some of the solution?
well, I think maybe the first thing you'd say is, well, yeah, how did we get into this fix? And we got into this fix because of the nature of common law reasoning, I think. Because remember, common law reasoning is all about matching. So I think recently John Kerry got in a kerfuffle with one of the ringmasters of the Swift boat. And T. Boone Pickens says, I'll give anybody $1 million who can prove anything was false in this. Okay, that's an offer, right? And Kerry says, okay, then I accept your offer. Okay, now, if you read law, one of the things you know is at that point your mind immediately goes to an 1893 case called Carlisle and the Carbolic Smokeball Company. And the Carbolic Smokeball Company is marketing a flu preventative. And they said, well, we'll give you £1,000 if you use our product as directed and you still get the flu. Mrs. Carlisle got the flu. And then the question is, well, was there a contract there? And the answer was yes, and Mrs. Carlisle accepted the contract by performance. And that's exactly what's happening with Kerry. And so if that case ever went to court, there's a strong likelihood that if Kerry proves his point, he will be able to collect $1 million because he's accepted the offer, and the template is the Carlisle and Carbolic Smokeball template. So certainly there's this component in the common law of matching. This looks like this, and then you go on. And that's how the common law works. You compare things to other things. And so with corporations, the move was to try to compare the corporation to the natural person and have a kind of homogeneity of the law. And so in some ways that's, it's not really the fault of common law lawyers because that's how they operate. And so you can't excessively beat on them for that. On the other hand, the standard way for modifying the common law, if it gets too twisted around itself, it is to clarify things through statute. That's the best function of statute, right? Is it clarifies the law. And so, for example, with the Zeebrugge disaster, by the way, the name of the ferry that sunk was the Herald of Free Enterprise.
Maybe we're getting messages from somewhere else.
In the Herald of Free Enterprise disaster, the common law malfunctions, and Parliament enters in and says, we're here to clarify this. And so yeah, that's an approach, is that you clarify the common law by statute. And by the way, the person in the state legislature who handles law reform is Jennifer Vega. So if you want to talk to somebody, you talk to Jennifer Vega. Now.
Well, but I'm wondering about, again, you're talking about matching. Matching is so important to so much of common law that if we're trying to do that and there's going to be an exact fit, and I see French trying to come up with all kinds of ways of stipulating the action of the person, you can imagine then a corporation coming up with something equivalent to the innocent by reason of insanity by setting up corporate policies that are absolutely chaotic in such a way that providing we're making progress towards making profit, if we ever get caught, all we have to say is the corporate structure is incoherent.
And this is exactly what happened in the Herald of Free Enterprise case. The corporation, you notice that we're in Britain, and so we're dealing with alter ego theory. Okay. And so what the corporate alter egos said is, no, we couldn't have it because what we did is we hired, and we have a policy that says we hire competent captains. And so it's not our fault that this moron set out to see what the whole door is open.
What our policy states is.
Yeah, and so we had a same policy, we had an insane operator. That's kind of the converse of what you had to say, but in the same sort of idea, right? That it's not guilty by reason of insanity. The agent, or the lower level agent, is insane. It doesn't roll back on us. And that's how they escaped the problem, that's how they escaped liability in Zeebrugge. The other sort of way that it was approached was in the New York Central case. The company said, well, it's unfair to attribute us, the company, with the actions of our agents, because that's making one person liable for the actions of another, and that ain't fair. That's a violation of the 14th Amendment, equal process, or due process, or whatever we call that, right? And the court said, well, that may be the case if we're talking about natural persons, but here we're talking about a creature of a state legislature whose mental state can be constituted however the state legislature wants to constitute that mental state. We're only looking at the corporate operator once it gets before the bench.
But then if we're able to do that, I'm wondering why don't we just come up with a separate law that deals with it? It doesn't need to look for intent at all. It doesn't need to look for mental states. It doesn't need to look for anything with relationship to the person.
Okay.
And it causes all kinds of problems with respect to the philosopher's concern about the
Yes.
intention of something which is negative.
Okay.
Just have a separate.
Okay, at that point then, what I would say and what French would say is, well, that's not my bad. I'm trying to help these people.
Yeah.
I'm trying to work with the scheme that's in place. And so, in a sense, I'm working at a kind of micro level and trying to prevent the conditional from failing. And what you want to do is you want to rewrite the conditional.
Well, right, and in fact, I'm thinking that the precedent is established in such a way as to make us think that we're dealing with individuals, when in fact we're really not. We're dealing with something entirely different, just as an ecosystem is different from individual species. And we all know that focusing on, say, the endangered species list is not the best approach to environmental issues because we have all kinds of problems. If we focus on the ecosystem, we're going to be much more successful. But it's a different biology.
Okay, yeah, and we do that in law, again, through statute. Okay, call Jennifer Viega. You know, and say we need to have you know, strict liability for all corporate offenses. Is the way you'd say that. Say all corporate offenses are strict liability offenses. And then, of course, it'd make it very easy for trial lawyers collecting damages. I mean, yes, I mean, I see exactly what you're saying. And
But it's not the
you might
reality.
very well think that that's what I'd like to do, but I couldn't comment.
Well, yeah, but one of the cool things about the question, though, in terms of suggesting a solution, is that with an individual, everything is synapse to synapse. You never know what's going on. You have to infer intent from what they've done. And actually, one of the nice things about this is it opens up the fact that you have to have a communication from an actor to an actor that leaves an evidentiary record. And so that may in fact turn out to be, you know, a very valuable concept.
Well, and the notion that the law is essentially not dealing with the internal brain state. They are frequently dealing with actions and at least external manifestations of what an individual's intention would be. And a corporation is dealing with all kinds of, you know, externally observable manifestations. So if you're seeing a manifestation, you label it, whether it's an individual, whether it's a corporation. I suppose that's the way.
I wonder about these unstated rules of recognition. Because it seems like you're saying we identify corporate policy not in what's written in the manual, which is never going to nail it, but on what people actually do. And when we look at what they're actually doing, then we can see, you know, the rules, that, as you put it, the rules that people actually abide by. That's where we could make accountability stick. The thing is, are those really fully public? I mean, he says they're unstated rules of recognition. They're the things that people whisper, and often they're the things that people model without ever having said anything at all.
Yeah.
So how do you trace those?
That's a good question. It's problematic. You know, sort of the facile answer is in discovery, make sure you get the deleted emails. Okay. That's one thing, but that's not a real answer to your question. I think the more substantial answer is how narrow.
About 10 minutes.
Okay, 10 minutes. Okay. Well, one of the things that gave me fits when I was studying the English Constitution is they have this whole notion of conventions, constitutional conventions. And because it's such an old society that's never developed a single written document as a constitution. The Brits have a constitution. It's not, you can't, like, you know, go to the British Museum and see it though. Like that, it's a web of policies and practices and all, you know, and all sorts. And so there's, you know, and so one of the conventions that they have in Britain, for example, is that whenever the Prime Minister gives advice to the Queen is constitutionally obliged to take that advice. And so if you saw that movie, The Queen, you know, Elizabeth II didn't want to engage in sort of ostentatious public mourning for Princess Diana. And people were getting very soured on monarchy. Tony Blair calls the Queen and says, "Ma'am, I advise you to engage in public mourning." What that actually is it's, you know, couched, the public face of it is advice, right? The way it actually operates as a convention is an order. There's a similar sort of thing that happened with Edward VIII and Stanley Baldwin. Edward VIII was the king who abdicated because he wanted to marry Mrs. Simpson, in a relation. And wanted to marry Mrs. Simpson. And what Stanley Baldwin did was he tricked Edward VIII into asking him for his advice. And Stanley Baldwin says, well, now that you ask, I should say that you should resign. And so it would be abdicated. Now, it's not written down anywhere, but it's the policy, it's the rule that's observed by everyone.
I guess that's what troubles me, right? Aren't we endlessly creative? Isn't that what people demonstrate? Like what the Hollywood films show you, is that, you know, corporate executives and
Yeah.
those guys are endlessly creative at finding ways of saying things without saying them.
Yeah, and in the
And they're
end,
unique and individual. They're not reproduced in any kind of uniform.
Plausible
yeah,
deniability.
plausible deniability. Yeah, and then that's a jury question, right? And what you say is, does the jury have grounds for believing that the unspoken policy was there? In the same way that, you know, do we have grounds for believing that the Queen can be ordered around by the Prime Minister? Publicly, no. Practices, yes. It's that sort of thing. And notice that Hart comes out of that British context, where that sounds less strange, I think, in the British context than does to us. And that's something that when I've read Hart, when I've read British constitutional theory, that's given me fits. Because I can't get my American brain around that. But that's okay. All we have to do is we just have to see evidence that the policy is there, even if the policy isn't there in a document. Yeah.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the answer that you like came from a British court. Is that right? The final case, the final solution that you mentioned?
It came from the UK Parliament.
UK Parliament, okay, right, UK Parliament. So in what ways have philosophers helped with this?
Philosophers have helped with this in...
It seems like we've done it all without philosophers, and...
Yeah, they've done it all without philosophers,
Yeah.
but here's how we help. Philosophers help because we have this second account from French, and what we say is, oh yes, what we really have here is we have the one last instance in which one of our old pet theories that we didn't think was any good actually operates, and that's philosophical behaviorism. And so what we can do as philosophers is that we can allow, what we can do as philosophers is we can give an account for why the right-hand side of the conditional makes sense. And so we end up not just, here's what we do as philosophers. We allow people to, or we allow the courts to not only apply a law, but we allow them to apply a rational law. But what we've given them is we've given them the gift of rationality.
Are you sure it wasn't the fact of their decision that gave that theory, philosophical theory, the gift of rationality?
Oh, okay, you're asking a causal question. How was it that the statute was arrived at, right? Yeah, I don't know how we got to the statute. What I can say is that we can explain the statute on good philosophical grounds.
I see.
Yeah, we can offer an explanation.
Well, I actually think there is a way in which philosophers have helped, which is by showing that there's a problem in trying to attribute to corporate entities mental states. That what the Parliament steps in because we cannot resolve satisfactorily the notion of, it's essentially where we've been trying to prove that which could not be proved, and we've shown in some sense that it's a fruitless effort, so we've come up with another way of stipulating the notion of corporate intent.
Are you saying that the Parliament read philosophy and stepped in because of philosophy?
Absolutely.
Or did they have legal cases they couldn't solve and they stepped in because of practical problems?
I think you're
Okay.
exactly right.
I just want to know if I like being the fifth wheel. I don't want anyone to take that away from me.
I mean, well, one thing I can say about H.L.A. Hart, when we're talking about these undisclosed rules of recognition, acknowledged on all sides, but H.L.A. Hart was a student of Wittgenstein. And all this talk about the public mind.
H.L.A. Hart is also a philosopher. He's regarded as such.
Which is funny because his actual career was, well, before he got to Oxford, his actual career was that he was a chancery barrister, and so he helped people, fight out who inherits under the testamentary trust. It's like that's his training. Did that convince you? Okay, well, thank you so much. It was wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about how to save a conditional.
Thank you, Bill. And there is food and drink in the other room.
Two models employing different concepts of state consciousness. The concept of state consciousness that the first model employs characterizes conscious states purely by their relational properties. See, I call these two different concepts of state consciousness because although state consciousness is always a property of the target state, in the two models, it's a property of the target state in virtue of different things, different parts of the target state, different properties of the target state. So it picks out the target state in virtue of different properties of that state. So in the first model, where we could represent the state accurately or inaccurately and still have it become conscious, the only thing that's important is the relation between the two states, not the information or anything else. And in the second model, because it requires that the information be the same or type equivalent at least partially, it's not just the relation that's important, it's the informational content of the lower order state that's relevant to it being considered to be state conscious or not. So I call these two different concepts of state consciousness. One where state consciousness is a relational property of a state, or applies to a state only in terms of its relational properties, and one where the informational properties and the relation is important.
How far are you willing to go with at least partially?
Well, I would say that it could be very, very like a pixel or something like that, you know, of a perceptual scene would have to be the same, and that insofar as that is represented accurately, that part of the state is conscious, or that pixel is considered to be conscious in line with the second model that develops the first and the third proposition. That's what I would have to say.
So by thinking I'm in pain, I might be like partially conscious that I'm afraid.
Oh, no. I would say that if you had a state that was something like, if the state consisted of everything that was in this room, if my perceptual state consisted of everything that was in this room, that maybe everything from here on could be represented accurately. And then what we would have to say is just that the lower order state is only part of the lower order state is conscious. Is what that would have to say. And then there's part that's just some kind of confabulation, hallucination, if there was something else added on to my higher order plot.
The woodland environment over here.
So
Woodland creature.
So the idea is that, so for ease I refer to these two different models as the first model is the relational state consciousness model, and the second model is the informational state consciousness model, even though the relation is still important. And no other properties in the relational state consciousness aside from the relation are responsible for the target state to being conscious. In contrast, the concept of state consciousness that the second model employs characterizes conscious states by their informational properties in addition to their relational properties. So Model 2 is constructed from claims 1 and 3, and again it just states that target states become conscious just in case they are accurately represented by higher order states. In order to be state conscious according to this model, in addition to being represented by a higher order thought, a state must be the bearer of a particular set of informational properties, and those are just the informational properties that are reflected in the representational content of the hot. So in other words, the informational properties must be type identical to the properties that are part of the content of our phenomenal experience, because the phenomenal experience comes from the higher order state. And so for ease, I call this informational state conscious. And so for the second model, there are two different ways you could run this model. One would be taking, rejecting statement 2 would be inaccurate, where it says that you could represent it inaccurately, and just endorsing statements 1 and 3. So according to that model, it just is not possible for higher order states to misrepresent their targets, because as statement 1 says, targets always become state conscious when they're represented by HOTS, and statement 3 says HOTS always represent conscious states accurately. So, according to this model, the representational mechanism responsible for higher order thoughts would simply not allow for the possibility of misrepresentation. But I'll just say that, that's not really a theory's place to decide what's possible for the brain, whether it's possible that there be misrepresentations like that. I mean, that's an empirical matter. It's not really a theoretical matter. We would have to figure out whether or not that kind of thing does occur. So that seems like a bad way to run this model. Although, since we don't know whether or not these kinds of misrepresentations can occur, probably the most theoretically satisfying version of the hot theory would be able to account for misrepresentations, theoretically, until we know that they can't happen. So since I've kind of stopped reading it and now I'm going off the top of my head, I'm going to go back to reading because I feel like I'll miss like important stuff.
Did you happen to mention what the criterion was for accurate representation?
No. And I think because he doesn't really give us he doesn't have a concept of what representation really is, what information is, whether it's like the truth conditions for something that make it equivalent, whether it's like logical equivalence or it couldn't be qualitative equivalence because the low order state doesn't really have qualitative properties the way like phenomenal experience does. So he doesn't really go into representation, what that is, what it requires in order to be a representation, what information is, or anything like that.
Or even the extent of information. I mean, it seems like, if I can interrupt, it seems like you have to define the bounds of representation. I mean, are we talking, you use the whole room, are we talking about the amalgamation of all of us on here? Are you talking about one individual? Are you talking about his honor?
Yeah.
There has to be some kind of boundary that we define beforehand before we can say whether any information is accurate or reflective of what the target is.
And one thing is that, he talks about mental states, and it seems as though he hasn't given us a model of like where to draw the boundary. I could say that I have a mental state of this room, where I could say that, oh, my state of this room is actually a conglomeration of like 1,000 different little states, and he hasn't given us a way of sort of parsing apart where the states, how small they are.
Okay, so he's riding on equivalency. How equivalency is doing the work. I just thought of this because I thought of the dental example, and I thought that how would we, in principle, verify empirically that the person wasn't in pain? There may be a certain area that's in pain, but people experience pain. It pain's all in the brain, and you can talk about this part of the mouth all you want. I guess if you had the world's greatest MRI machine, you could look at all of the neurons, right, and be able to know that this part of the mouth where you think you've localized the pain is not in pain, but then maybe some other part of the brain is firing.
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't know a lot about the brain, he doesn't know a lot about neurology. He's really just operating on the level of a broad theoretical model. It could work out in a number of different ways. It could seem highly plausible to say that, the perception starts here in the back of the brain, and then it's all brought together over here in this part of the brain, and maybe this is the lower order state, and this is the higher order state, or maybe he's working on a more abstract level, and that the lower order state starts here, and then the higher order state. It's really hard to...
Certain practical complications don't necessarily mean problems for his theory.
Yeah, it's true, yeah. It's vague enough that since he doesn't know a lot about the way that the brain works, it's vague enough that it could play out in any number of ways. The neuroscientist could take this model and say, well, let's see how much help this model is for us, and could play it out in a number of ways. And I think he purposely stays clear of issues that would trip him up when it came to someone determining whether or not this actually worked, So.
have a quick question just about, I'm starting to get lost just with regard to the two models, which could also like these three different claims.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to keep a hold on what the sort of intuitive motivation for these different claims is. So it seems like, for instance, the first model is going to allow you to say something you'd want to be able to say, such as, if I'm thinking I want to kill my father, I'm actually conscious of the fact that I want to marry my mother, right? And so it seems like you'd intuitively want to say, yes, you are conscious of that, but in this funny way, right?
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, okay, the first model gets you to keep that.
Right.
The second model, you lose that, but maybe you get to say something that's also kind of intuitive. And
Right.
to say, well, if what you're thinking is, I'm sitting here on my couch holding a knife waiting for Dad to come home, you might say, you're really not conscious of wanting to marry your mother.
Right. Right.
So, right, and so are those sort of the motivations?
You know, I think that the motivation for him saying that misrepresentation will make lower order states conscious is that this is an objection to his theory, that it seems like he really wants to kind of have something to say about. And since it is the case that if the higher order thought is really just a thought about another state, and when we have thoughts about the world or perceptions about the world, we can misrepresent them, and we often do, then, I mean, he's going to have to say, well, unless you could go into the brain and say, no, this misrepresentation doesn't happen, he's going to have to allow that it does happen, and it can't kill his theory.
And so I get, you don't want to lose.
Yeah.
I am thinking about the world, even though I'm mistaken about it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think he thinks that, you know, any further support and misrepresentation seems to give us some further support, because people who are on board with the Freudian stuff will say, oh yeah, you know, this is how it happens. Now I know how it happens in this theoretical way. And he seems to think that a lot of people are on board with the Freudian stuff too. So.
Well, moreover, you could virtually argue a priori that given information degradation in noisy channels, that you're always going to have some level of misrepresentation.
Yeah. Here's where, I mean, this is really, candidly, where I think.
It's just us.
You're on tape.
Oh my goodness. I think that the problem was that he wasn't thinking about misrepresentation when he first formulated his theory. He put forth the first proposition: conscious state is a state we're conscious of. You know, it always happens that way. That's just how it happens. That explains the difference between non-conscious and conscious states and stuff like that. And someone said, you know, misrepresentation happens, and he thought, well, I don't really want that to be an objection, and it seems like it could help me out, so okay, it happens. Now it seems like at this point what you need to do is go back and look at the theory the way that you originally put it forth and say, well, if I'm going to add this extra thing in, I need to make it consistent with the rest of my theory. Oh, look, I said always here, you know, when I thought that it was always accurate, and now I might have to change that. And so it seems like people in philosophy often have a problem with changing their mind or adding something or saying, well, you know, I maybe I formulated it a little unclear in the beginning, but now I'm a little clearer about it. I've been thinking about it for more years, so let me get clearer about it and say that in cases like this, it doesn't happen. But people seem to think that if they're wrong, that's, you know, that they can't be wrong, that that's somehow a fault of theirs, like that, you know. And so, I don't know. So personally, I think that he made a mistake when he accepted misrepresentation by not changing those things in the beginning of his theory, and that just has provided like a place for people to make objections and objections and objections since then. And really what you need to do is say, the model is still kind of the same. The phenomenal character happens with the representing state. The only problem is that you're calling this state the conscious state. Now that was fine and not problematic when they were both the same, but now that they're not the same, you know, in order to keep people from saying, well, this leads to absurd consequences, you need to just change the way you describe the model. and you need to say something different. I think this is the conscious state, the phenomenal state, you know. A conscious state is just a special kind of state. It represents a non-conscious state. This still describes the difference between the two. It still leaves us with the conclusion that you can have non-conscious states apart from not having conscious states, or that all conscious states started off as got their content from these lower order states. It still lets us say the things about the oboe and the wine tasting. It just provides a much more intuitive description that's less likely to provoke all of these kind of irrelevant debates that aren't really getting to the heart of the matter. I mean, you don't really want to pick at someone's theory because they expressed it really poorly. You want to, in the end, come up, where's the strongest description of this model? Is this model helpful? And ultimately, the idea is this a helpful model? You know, will this help scientists figure something out? Because that's what he wanted in the beginning, was to help provide a reductive theory of consciousness. Ultimately, that's maybe the scientist's job. The philosopher does like the theoretical work, gives it to the scientist. The scientist says, this might be helpful, or nah, this doesn't work because, you know, there's other things we've decided. But that's where I think the problem is that, you know, when misrepresentation became an objection and he brought it on board, he should have changed the description of the theory a little bit. Oh, that was wrong, or I didn't think about this. I mean, that's fine to do, I think.
Auto output of the whole, how's that pronounced?
So that's what I think is going on there. I think that the two models are still the same models. I mean, ultimately, the same thing is happening. Architecturally, you have this state, there's a representation of this state in this state. This state gives us a phenomenal character. You don't call any of them conscious, or any of them the higher order state, or the state conscious state, or anything like that. Both of the models are the same. Architecturally and functionally, the way the models work is the same. The only difference between these two models, as I would develop them, with the higher order state being the conscious state, is the terminology that you apply to the different pieces of the model. That's what I see to be the main issue there. And
There is this one further wrinkle, though, that if the higher order thought is to be a thought of a thought, then it needs to be a thought of this thought, no matter how badly represented this thought is by this content. So you need at least some sort of causal theory about how this is in fact a representation of this, if it's a really bad representation.
Yeah. I think ultimately the representation, he hasn't provided a model of what representation is, but I think that this is going to help us scientifically. I think it is a causal process, but that's just all he means by representation. So there are different ways to cash out representation. I think it will just be a causal process, with maybe some other bells and whistles coming in from other angles of the brain or something,
Can you, this is just a very general question because this is an area that I don't know a lot about. How does veridicality get tied in? In other words, why make veridicality a criterion of whether or not something is conscious? And I guess the reason I thought of this was when you were talking about the oboe. The description you gave was that unless, this is my phrasing, unless you can name distinct qualitative aspects of the oboe, your experience is going to be impoverished.
Yeah.
Now, an awful lot of people listen to a lot of music. They experience food over and over again. They gather together an enormous quantity of experience with different things. This is true of sports analysis, right? Lots of people who don't have much education have very elaborate ideas about strategies in sports, but anyway, but it sounds like it from the fact that someone can experience something in great diversity and in great magnitude, it would seem that they can develop a rather rich experience of it, but it sounds like what he's saying is that unless you put names and labels and discriminating things on them, then which is a knowledge-oriented process, you cannot have an experience of the same richness. Now that seems to be extremely biased towards things like veridicality or towards knowledge, but there's a lot more to experience than knowing, right?
Yeah, I mean, some objections to this theory are that this is just it requires too much from us cognitively. Are you going to say that an infant or an animal who doesn't have concepts the way that we normally talk about concepts as kind of these things that are individuated by their kind of semantic or linguistic characteristics, you know, that we have to be able to use them in abstract ways, or, you know, a creature that just doesn't have concepts does not have conscious experience. I mean, are you going to say that people have made this objection? And you know, he's like, well, maybe they do. Maybe they have very, 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 very primitive concepts. You know, and the concept is just like a belief about an object. You know, they have a concept of an object or something, and so when they experience it, they have the phenomenal properties, but it's just kind of like really. It's just characterized in terms of just an object or something like that. I mean, some people think that that's not a good rebuttal to that objection. And the other higher order theories are like higher order perception theories, which aren't the word's not coming to me, but this objection doesn't work against those theories because they're just like that in order for a state to be conscious, we have to have a higher order perception of it. And so perception doesn't really require, according to that kind of theory, cognitive capacities. So yeah.
I have a son who's about a year and a half. He's a very picky eater. So he has a rather nuanced sense of what he likes and doesn't like, and he even anticipates when I'm going to give him something he doesn't like. He doesn't have any language yet, not that I know of.
But your objection seems to highlight that language itself is just a mechanism for representing certain states of consciousness. I mean, if you look at the words on your page, aren't they just a metaphor for representing different states of consciousness for each that we apply to each word, and therefore an animal or an infant doesn't need this secondary tool as a quality or as a function of having these states of consciousness. It can represent it, as you say, just as in a field, like donut.
Yeah. Well, you know, personally, I think that the way the concepts have been characterized in the analytic tradition is really wrong-headed because they start with language, and they analyze language to figure out what the elements of language are, and concepts play a part in that, and then they analyze concepts in terms of the properties that linguistic expressions have. But it seems to me to be the case that language is kind of derivative of a different kind of more primordial experience. And so if you're going to look for the origin of linguistic structures, you need to look in the origin, you need to look in a kind of more basic level of experience. And so some people think that, well, if you want to define a concept as kind of a linguistic entity, or an entity with kind of linguistic-like properties, language-like properties, things that we can use like the way we use language, then fine, keep the word concept applied to that. Concepts come from something, some kind of type of categorization that happens, you know, at a much earlier level of it. And infants, animals can make distinctions between things, put things in categories, and so concepts are basically just abstractions.
Yeah, I know. My objection is not that there wouldn't be maybe a larger class of things that could count as a concept. My objection was that there can be something which we'd all agree was enriched experience, which didn't involve the cognitive application of even this larger category of concepts. But it's no doubt that when someone tells me words to describe smells, I have an enriched experience. I don't doubt that aspect. I'm just thinking that may not be a necessary component to enriching experience. And if that's true, then we're pushing veridicality and cognition over to one side, and we're saying something else can also do the job.
controversy in cognitive psychology. How do we store information? Do we store it propositionally? Do we store it visually? Do we store it, auditorily? And it's like maybe all those ways, and it seems like this model doesn't account for the fact that there are that controversy is core. I mean,
Well, he has said that he thinks that Jerry Fodor is the greatest philosopher alive. And so I take it that he's really big on the language of thought hypothesis, and that he really thinks that we probably store things propositionally. And so his theory is kind of embedded in that, and he may,
It's clear to me that that's the case, because I know that there are theorists who think, well, no, we don't, that's a second order storage device.
Yeah.
That there's a much more primordial order of storage. So, that's
So I know that he's wedded to the proposition. Yeah. I mean, I think that maybe we can talk about the primordial stuff. We can kind of translate it into maybe propositional, and like still use theories that assume that this kind of propositional model, as long as we keep in mind
I was just reflecting on that if Jerry's the best we've got in this generation, we're in trouble.
Well, let me say what I think is the root of the problem here. What I think happens, and I think he picks this up from Jerry Fodor actually, coincidentally, and that's that he there's this type token distinction that he doesn't utilize properly or doesn't make. So when he talks about mental states becoming conscious, it's unclear whether he means that the token target state becomes conscious or the type qualities become conscious. And of course, when we're talking about consciousness as becoming a property of the state, we want to say it becomes a property of the token, because there's no such thing as consciousness becoming a property of just some abstract informational state. But I think that he's like kind of doesn't think about this, and so he employs mental state in this kind of ambiguous way, and he doesn't make this distinction, and it has bad consequences for his theory. And I mean, the most absurd thing that's saying that a target state is the one that becomes conscious when the higher order state falsely represents it is that it's also the case that we can completely hallucinate an experience of the world, and there is no thing that the hallucination is corresponding to. So if this happens with mental states, that this one is just a hallucination and it doesn't correspond to any target at all, he's forced to say, according to his theory, that we have phenomenal experience, we can walk around having phenomenal experience and no conscious states at all. So, I'm walking around having phenomenal experiences and no conscious states at all. And so, he could do one of two things. He could just bite the bullet and be like, well, yeah, that happens sometimes, Or this is where the error in his articulation of the theory really comes out, I think, I think that he could save the model if the model's helpful and make consciousness a property of the higher order state, change some things around with the way you describe it. Or you could, admit defeat with that. So.
We got a class in here now?
My class is in here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we can continue on.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah,